I was kneeling before the humble wooden altar in my chapel, head bowed, whispering prayers for those suffering under occupation, when urgent pounding shook the front door. The sound echoed through the empty nave, startling me from my communion with God. I made the sign of the cross, rose from my knees with a slight wince. They grew stiffer each year, and walked down the center aisle. The pounding continued, more insistent now. "Coming," I called, quickening my pace. I pulled open the heavy oak door to find Private Vernon O'Reilly standing on the steps. The American soldier's uniform was dirty, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. But what drew my attention was the small child partially hidden behind his legs. "Father Fry," O'Reilly said, his voice rough. "Sorry to burst in like this. This is Jean Soto." The little girl couldn't have been older than 8. She had matted dark hair and wore a dress that might once have been blue, but was now mostly gray with dirt. Her eyes, dark, hollow things, stared somewhere past me, focusing on nothing. In her arms, she clutched a porcelain doll with painted features, holding it against her chest like it was her only possession in the world. "What happened?" I asked, already stepping aside to let them enter. O'Reilly guided Jean into the chapel with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Germans swept through her village yesterday, killed her parents right in front of her, found her hiding in a cabinet when we came through." He lowered his voice. "She hasn't spoken a word since." My heart sank. Another innocent life shattered by this endless war. "Of course she can stay here," I said without hesitation. "The chapel is overlooked most days. She'll be safer here than anywhere." Relief washed over O'Reilly's face. "Thanks, Father. I knew you'd help. We can't take her with us where we're headed." "You don't need to explain," I assured him. O'Reilly knelt before Jean. "You'll be safe with Father Fry, okay? He's going to take good care of you until we can find somewhere permanent for you to go." Jean showed no sign she heard him. Her eyes remained fixed on some middle distance, her small fingers white-knuckled around her doll. O'Reilly stood and turned to me. "I need to get back to my unit. They're probably wondering where I am already." "God be with you, Private," I said. "And with you, Father." He glanced back at Jean once more, genuine concern in his eyes, before heading back out into the gray morning. After closing the door, I turned to the silent child standing motionless in the middle of my chapel. Her stillness was unnatural for one so young. "Jean?" I said softly. "My name is Father Scott. You can call me Scott if you prefer." I waited for any acknowledgement, but received none. "Let me show you where you can stay." I walked slowly toward the sanctuary, looking back to make sure she followed. After a moment's hesitation, she did, her footsteps nearly silent on the stone floor. I led her through the sanctuary, past the sacristy where I kept the sacred vessels, and to a small door at the back. It opened into a modest room with a single window high on the wall. A simple cot with a gray blanket stood against one wall, a small wooden chair against another. It wasn't much, but it was private and hidden. "This will be your room," I explained, stepping inside. "No one will find you here." Jean entered but remained standing just inside the doorway. "Are you hungry? I have some bread and cheese." When she didn't respond, I added, "I'll bring you something anyway." I went to the kitchen attached to my living quarters and returned with half a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a cup of water. Jean had not moved from her spot, still clutching her doll. "Please, sit," I said, gesturing to the cot. "You must be tired." After a long moment, Jean walked to the cot and sat on its edge, her back rigid. The doll remained fixed in her grip, its painted eyes staring blankly at me. I placed the food next to her. That's a beautiful doll you have. Does she have a name? Jean's expression didn't change. No response, not even a flicker of recognition that I'd spoken. Well, you can tell me when you're ready, I said, trying to keep my tone light. You're safe here, Jean, I promise. Throughout the morning, I checked on her regularly. Each time, I found her in exactly the same position, sitting straight backed on the edge of the cot, the doll clutched to her chest, food untouched. I tried different approaches to draw her out. Would you like to hear a story from the Bible? I asked during one visit, sitting in the wooden chair across from her. I could tell you about David, who was just a boy when he showed great courage. Her eyes remained fixed on the wall behind me. During another visit, I brought a small wooden cross. This was given to me when I was not much older than you, I explained. It helped me when I was afraid. Still nothing. I even tried singing quietly. Gentle hymns I thought might comfort her. Amazing Grace earned no reaction. Jesus loves me similarly failed to penetrate whatever wall she had built around herself. At noon, the chapel bells began their daily toll, a tradition I maintained despite everything. The effect on Jean was immediate and disturbing. She dropped her doll, clapped her hands over her ears, and began rocking back and forth, her face contorted in what looked like pain. Jean. I moved toward her, then stopped, unsure if I should touch her. It's just the bells. They'll stop soon. And they did. But Jean continued rocking for nearly a minute afterward, before slowly returning to her previous stillness, picking up her doll with trembling hands. That reaction troubled me deeply. Was it the sudden noise that frightened her? Or did the bells remind her of something from the attack on her family? I made a mental note to warn her before the bells rang tomorrow. As afternoon turned to evening, my concern only grew. Jean had not eaten, had not spoken, had not used the small chamber pot I'd provided, had shown no interest in anything except that doll. Looking at her hollow eyes, eyes that seemed to have witnessed horrors beyond understanding, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. But wasn't this exactly what one would expect from a child who had watched her parents murdered? The poor girl was in shock, traumatized beyond words. Of course, her behavior would seem strange, even unsettling. I brought fresh water and more food for the evening, placing it near her, though I doubted she would touch it. I'll be just through that door if you need anything in the night, I told her, pointing to the door that connected to my small quarters. Anytime at all, you just come and wake me. As I prepared to leave, Jean's head turned slightly, the first voluntary movement I'd seen her make all day. For a brief moment, I thought she might speak, but she only stared at me with those empty eyes before turning back to face the wall. I closed her door halfway, leaving it cracked so she would not feel trapped, and returned to my quarters. As I prepared for bed, I found myself praying more fervently than usual, asking for guidance in helping this broken child. Little did I know what I had truly welcomed into my chapel. Had I known, would I have turned her away? Even now I cannot say. I heard vehicles approaching the village. The deep rumble of engines broke the morning quiet, pulling me away from my prayers. I went to the chapel's front window, peered through the dusty glass, and saw 2 German military trucks rolling into the square, their green paint dirty from the country roads. Several soldiers jumped out, followed by a tall officer I recognized as Nicholas Miller. His back was straight as a ruler as he barked orders at his men. They spread out across the village square, each with rifles ready. My stomach twisted as I watched them approach the first house, pounding on the door with the butts of their weapons. They're looking for someone, I whispered to myself. watching as they moved methodically from building to building. The villagers who answered were pushed aside as soldiers entered their homes. Jean. The realization hit me hard. I turned from the window and rushed down the corridor toward the back room where I'd left her. My footsteps echoed on the stone floor as I hurried, whispering prayers under my breath. I pushed open the door, expecting to see her sitting exactly where I'd left her last night, still clutching that porcelain doll. The room was empty. The cot where she had sat for hours was undisturbed, the food I'd brought still untouched on the small table. "Jean?" I called, looking around the small space. I checked under the cot, behind the old wooden wardrobe, anywhere a small child might hide. Nothing. I backed out of the room, turning in a full circle. "Jean?" I called again, louder this time, my voice bouncing off the chapel walls. Where could she have gone? She had barely moved since arriving. I rushed to check the confessional booths, the supply closet, even the small kitchen area. With each empty space, my worry grew. The Germans were getting closer. I could hear their boots on the cobblestones outside. The main doors of the chapel creaked open just as I returned to the nave. Nicholas Müller stepped inside, flanked by 2 lieutenants. The taller one had a scar running along his jawline. Weber, I thought. The other was younger, with close-cropped blonde hair, Schmidt. "Father Fry," Müller said, removing his cap as he entered the sacred space. His voice was cold but correct. "We're conducting a search of the village." I nodded, trying to appear calm. "What are you looking for, Captain?" "We have reports of American soldiers in the area," he said, his eyes moving past me to survey the chapel. "And civilians harboring refugees." Schmidt and Weber had already started walking along the sides of the chapel, looking between the pews, checking the corners. "I have seen no American soldiers," I said carefully. The truth, at least. O'Reilly had been gone for days. Should I mention Jean? She was just a child, not a soldier. But if they found her after I denied her presence? Before I could decide, a soft singing floated through the air. The clear, high voice of a child singing "Frère Jacques" made all of us turn our heads. "Frère Jacques, dormez-vous? Dormez-vous?" Miller's eyes narrowed. "Who is that?" he demanded. I shook my head, genuinely confused. "I don't know." The singing seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the walls themselves were producing it. "Sonnez les matinées. Sonnez les matinées. Ding, dang, dong. Ding, dang, dong." "Search the building," Miller ordered his men. They moved with purpose now, opening doors, looking behind the altar. I stood in the center of the chapel, trying to figure out where Jean could be hiding. The singing didn't seem to come from any direction I could pinpoint. It was as if it surrounded us, filling the air itself. The air grew cold, not the normal morning chill of the stone chapel, but an unnatural cold that made my breath visible. I rubbed my arms, looking around in growing confusion. A loud crash came from the direction of the sacristy. The sound of metal hitting stone echoed through the chapel. "There!" Lieutenant Schmidt called out, already moving toward the small room off to the side where we kept the ceremonial items. Weber and Müller followed quickly. I hesitated, then hurried after them, unsure what I would find. The sacristy door was ajar, and I could see the men's backs as they entered. "What is this?" Miller's voice held a note of surprise. I squeezed past Weber to see what they'd found. There, sitting on the small cot we kept for visiting clergy, was Jean. She sat perfectly straight, her porcelain doll resting on her lap, its painted face staring directly at the Germans. A fallen candlestick lay on the floor, the source of the crash. "A child?" Schmidt said, lowering his rifle slightly. Jeanne looked different somehow. Her eyes, vacant yesterday, now seemed focused and aware. Too aware. She stared at Miller with an intensity that made my skin go cold. "Jean," I said, stepping forward. "I was looking for you." She didn't look at me. Her gaze remained fixed on the German officer. "You will all be dead soon," Jean said. But the voice wasn't hers. It was deep, adult, and entirely wrong coming from the mouth of an 8-year-old girl. The words hung in the air, as solid and real as the stone walls around us. I pressed back against the doorframe, cold sweat breaking out across my forehead as I looked between the German soldiers and this child who no longer seemed like a child at all. I watched in horror as Nicholas Miller's face contorted with anger and suspicion. He stepped toward Jean, his boots clicking on the stone floor. "Seize that child," Miller ordered, his voice sharp in the small confines of the sacristy. "Now!" Lieutenant Schmidt moved forward, hands outstretched toward Jean. My heart pounded as I tried to think of what to do, how to protect her. Then I saw it. The doll's head, the porcelain face Jean had clutched so tightly since arriving, turned by itself. Not Jean moving it, but the doll turning its own head with a faint ceramic scraping sound. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks. Schmidt was inches from Jean when the doll's painted face split open down the middle. The crack widened, revealing rows of needle-like teeth where there should have been only solid porcelain. My mind couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. "I was just..." Schmidt began, but never finished. The doll launched itself from Jean's lap with impossible speed. It latched onto Schmidt's throat, those needle teeth sinking deep. Blood bubbled around the punctures as Schmidt grabbed at the doll, trying to pull it away. His fingers slipped uselessly across the smooth porcelain surface. I stumbled backward until I hit the wall, my legs nearly giving out. The doll, this thing that wasn't a doll at all, tore through Schmidt's flesh with strength no child's toy should possess. Schmidt made wet, gargling sounds as he dropped to his knees, hands still clawing weakly at his neck. I couldn't move. My back pressed hard against the wall as if I could somehow push myself through it and escape. My mouth opened and closed, but prayers died in my throat. Miller's face had gone white. He fumbled for the holster at his side, pulling out his pistol with shaking hands. "Ha, Gott im Himmel," he whispered, raising the gun toward Jean and the creature. The doll dropped from Schmidt's ruined throat as the lieutenant collapsed onto the floor. With a sound like breaking china, it skittered across the stones toward Miller. The officer fired once, the gunshot deafeningly loud in the small room. But the bullet chipped the wall behind the moving doll. Before Miller could fire again, the creature leaped upward, tiny porcelain hands somehow strong enough to pull the tall officer down. I watched, frozen in terror, as those teeth found Miller's face. Blood sprayed across the room in an arc, spattering the walls, the floor, my cassock. Miller screamed, the sound quickly becoming something wet and choked. The third officer, Weber, broke from his trance of horror. He turned and ran, boots slipping in the growing pool of blood. The doll's head snapped toward the sound of his retreat. Weber's footsteps echoed through the corridor, then into the main chapel. For a moment, I thought he might escape. Then came his screams, distant but clear, followed by the same wet, tearing sounds I'd just witnessed. The screaming stopped abruptly. Through all of this, Jean sat completely still on the cot. Her face showed nothing, no fear, no satisfaction, not even awareness. She might have been looking at a blank wall rather than a massacre. The contrast between the violence and her calm made everything more terrifying. When the sounds from the chapel stopped, I heard small, pattering footsteps returning. The blood-covered doll appeared in the doorway, then moved with that unnatural skittering motion back to Jean. Before my eyes, the split in its face closed up, the teeth disappeared, and it became once again a simple porcelain doll with a painted smile. Jean picked it up and placed it carefully in her lap, stroking its hair with small fingers. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jean looked directly at me. Her eyes seemed older somehow, knowing in ways no child should be. She raised one finger to her lips in the universal gesture for silence. "She makes them pay," Jean whispered, her voice now a child's again. "For hurting my family." I couldn't speak. My hands gripped the wooden cross hanging from my neck so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Jean looked down at the doll, continuing to stroke its hair as if nothing unusual had happened. When I finally found the courage to look away from her, to check the bodies on the floor, they weren't there. I blinked hard, looking around wildly. The blood that had soaked into my cassock, splattered the walls, pooled on the floor, all gone. Schmidt and Müller had vanished. I looked back at the cot where Jean had been sitting, but she too had disappeared, along with her doll. The sacristy was empty, except for me. On unsteady legs, I made my way back to the chapel, certain I would find Weber's remains. But the nave was empty and clean. The pews stood in neat rows, the altar cloth lay smooth and white, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the stone floor. There were no bodies, no blood, no screaming child or monstrous doll. Nothing to prove what I had seen was real. I sat trembling in a pew, clutching my rosary so tightly the beads dug into my palm. The wooden crucifix swung back and forth as my hands shook. The chapel remained eerily quiet after what I'd witnessed. Too quiet, as if the very stones held their breath. The front doors creaked open, and I turned to see Private O'Reilly step inside, followed by a man I recognized as Sergeant Francisco Hayes from his previous visits to our village. "Father Fry?" O'Reilly called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. I couldn't find my voice at first. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming, though I hadn't made a sound since whatever had happened in the sacristy. I raised a hand weakly to signal my presence. The two soldiers walked down the center aisle, boots echoing on the stone floor. Hayes studied me with a careful, measured gaze that suggested he'd seen men in my state before. "Father, you don't look well," Hayes said, sitting in the pew across from me. "Where's the girl? The one Vernon brought to you?" I swallowed hard, trying to find words to explain something I couldn't understand myself. "She's gone. Jean is gone." My voice cracked on the last word. "Gone where?" O'Reilly asked, glancing toward the back of the chapel. "I don't know." I rubbed my face with both hands. "She was here with 3 German officers, and then—" I trailed off, unable to articulate what I'd seen. The officers vanished too, all of them. No blood, no bodies, nothing. As if they were never here. Hayes and O'Reilly exchanged a long look that made my stomach clench. There was meaning in that glance, a confirmation of something they already suspected. "Father," Hayes began carefully, leaning forward. The farmhouse where Private O'Reilly found Jean was the site of a German massacre 2 weeks ago. I frowned, trying to process his words. 2 weeks? But Vernon brought her to me yesterday. "Yes, sir," O'Reilly said quietly. "That's what makes this complicate." "Yes, sir," O'Reilly said quietly. "That's what makes this complicated. He pulled off his helmet and set it beside him on the pew. The thing is, Father, among the victims was a young girl. She matches Jean's description exactly. My fingers tightened around the rosary. The beads cut deeper into my palm, but I barely felt it. What are you saying? Hayes cleared his throat. We interviewed survivors from nearby farms. They identified all the victims, including an 8-year-old girl named Jean Soto. A chill crept through my body, starting at my spine and spreading outward. I shook my head. That's impossible. The child was here. I spoke to her, tried to feed her. Did she eat? Hayes asked, his tone gentle but probing. Did she speak? I thought back to the untouched plate of food, her silence until that terrible moment in the sacristy when her voice changed. No. Hayes nodded as if I'd confirmed something. The locals have stories about this region, Father. They call them les enfants silencieux, the silent children. What does that mean? I asked, though part of me already knew, already feared the answer. Children who were murdered unjustly, Hayes explained, his voice dropping lower. They say these children sometimes return, carrying objects that contain their vengeance. My stomach twisted violently. The room seemed to tilt around me. That doll, the way it had moved, the teeth that appeared where there should have been none, the blood that vanished with the bodies. I need to know, I managed to say. If anyone survived who might know more about Jean. O'Reilly nodded. A woman named Edna Becker. She lived on the neighboring farm. She told us something interesting about that doll Jean carried. What about it? I whispered. It was an old family heirloom, Hayes said. According to Edna, the Germans tried to take it from Jean before they... He didn't finish the sentence. Before they killed her, I completed, my voice hollow. They tried to take her doll, and then they killed her. Hayes nodded grimly. Edna said she heard the child screaming that they couldn't have it. Then gunshots. When our patrol found the scene days later, the bodies were there, but no sign of Jean or her doll. Until I found her hiding in that cabinet, O'Reilly added, rubbing his neck. At least I thought I did. We should go, Hayes said after a long silence. He stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. Father, whatever you've seen, it might be best not to speak of it to others. I nodded numbly. What could I possibly say? Who would believe me? They left a few minutes later, their footsteps fading into the gathering darkness outside. The chapel door closed with a heavy thud that echoed through the empty building. I remained alone in the pew, the rosary bead still wrapped around my fingers. My faith, my entire understanding of the world, lay shattered around me. I had sheltered a ghost, a child whose suffering was so great that she had returned from death itself to exact her vengeance. Hours passed. Darkness fell completely. I couldn't bring myself to light the candles, to move from the pew where I sat. My mind raced through theological arguments, through everything I had been taught about death, about the soul, about vengeance and justice. Then, just as the old clock in the bell tower struck midnight, I heard it. The soft, sweet voice of a child singing Frère Jacques somewhere in the shadows of the chapel. Frère Jacques, dormez-vous? Dormez-vous? The melody floated through the darkness, as innocent as it was terrifying. I rose from the pew on unsteady legs. Jean? I called into the darkness. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, calm despite the fear coursing through me. I know what you are now. I know what happened to you." The singing stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it. The light click of porcelain against stone. Tiny footsteps moving across the chapel floor, away from me, toward the door. Click, click, click. The sound grew fainter until it disappeared completely, and I knew the presence had left the chapel. I remained at the chapel until liberation came in 1944. The occupation dragged on, month after month, with German forces controlling our small village and the surrounding countryside. Even after what I had witnessed with John and her doll, perhaps because of it, I couldn't bring myself to leave. This sacred space, once a simple house of worship, now held secrets that bound me to it. Though I never saw Jean directly again, I began to notice disturbing patterns emerging over the months. Whenever German patrols ventured too close to the village, soldiers would go missing. At first, it seemed coincidental. A single patrol failing to return, a lone soldier vanishing while separated from his unit. But as winter turned to spring and spring to summer, the incidents became impossible to ignore. 2 men missing near the old mill, the villagers would whisper. Search party found nothing. I would hear about their bodies being discovered days later, often in the dense woods beyond the village or in abandoned farm buildings. The descriptions were always similar. Strange, jagged wounds covering the corpses, as if they had been torn apart by something small but incredibly strong. The German commanders blamed resistance fighters, increasing security and imposing harsh curfews. But their measures proved ineffective. On certain nights, I would wake from troubled sleep to hear a child singing softly in the distance. The melody was always the same. Frère Jacques, the simple tune that had played through my chapel that fateful day. I noticed a pattern. The singing only came when Germans were nearby, often preceding reports of missing soldiers. I would lie awake, rosary beads clutched in my trembling hands, listening as the innocent nursery rhyme drifted through the darkness like a death knell. "Father, did you hear it last night?" Madame Beaufort asked one morning as I distributed what little bread we had to share. The singing. My grandson heard it too. I nodded, but offered no explanation. What could I say? That the voice belonged to a ghost, a murdered child whose spirit remained to enact vengeance. That her porcelain doll came alive with teeth like needles to tear flesh from bone. Summer faded into autumn, and autumn into another bitter winter. The pattern continued. German soldiers went missing, bodies were found. And on quiet nights, the singing would come. I began to understand that Jean's vengeance continued throughout the occupation. A relentless force of retribution that the German forces could neither comprehend nor stop. Some villagers whispered about a ghost child seen fleetingly at dusk or dawn. A small figure with dark hair clutching something to her chest, vanishing when approached. They crossed themselves and avoided certain paths after dark. They left small offerings, a slice of bread, a carved wooden toy, at crossroads or near the woods where the singing was heard. Old superstitions resurfaced, protective charms hung in windows. I never shared what I had witnessed that day in the chapel. Who would believe that I had sheltered a ghost? That I had seen men torn apart by a porcelain doll, animated by vengeance? And if they did believe, what comfort could such knowledge bring? Better to let them create their own explanations, to find ways to live alongside the unexplainable. In my private moments, on my knees before the altar, I struggled. My prayers became questions, my faith a fragile thing I couldn't quite grasp anymore. The seminary had not prepared me for this, for witnessing divine punishment enacted through a murdered child and her doll. searched Scripture for answers, finding only more questions. "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," says the Lord. The words from Romans twisted in my mind. Was Jean an instrument of God's vengeance? Or something else entirely, something outside the theological framework I had devoted my life to understanding? The war eventually ended. Allied forces pushed through France, and one bright morning in the summer of 1944, American tanks rolled into our village. The people celebrated in the streets, flags appeared as if by magic, and wine flowed freely for the first time in years. But while others found joy in liberation, I found myself adrift. My faith was forever altered by the encounter with Joan and her doll. I couldn't reconcile my traditional beliefs with what I had experienced. A murdered child enacting justice when adults could not. The God I had been taught to worship was one of mercy and forgiveness, not vengeful justice delivered through the hands of the innocent. Yet, hadn't Jeanne delivered a form of justice? Hadn't she punished those who had committed atrocities, who had stolen lives and futures? The theological questions haunted me more than the memories of blood and screams. I spent hours at my desk, books open before me, seeking answers in old texts. What was the nature of divine justice? Could vengeance ever be holy? Was Jeanne's retribution against her murderers a sin or a righteous act? In the quiet of the chapel, late at night when doubts crowded my mind, I would remember Jeanne's face, blank and traumatized when she arrived, focused and determined in that last moment in the sacristy. I would recall her words. She makes them pay for hurting my family. Simple, direct, the uncomplicated justice of a child. Though terrified by the memory, I found I couldn't condemn Jeanne's actions. The Germans had murdered her, had tried to take even her cherished doll. They had killed her parents before her eyes. What right had I to judge her response? What moral authority could I claim that would allow me to say her vengeance was wrong? I stayed at the chapel long after liberation. Many priests moved on, seeking new parishes or returning to places they had left during the occupation. But I remained, tied to this place by memories and questions I couldn't escape. The villagers accepted my continued presence, perhaps understanding that I had been changed by the war in ways they couldn't fully know. On rare occasions, usually on cold, moonless nights when the wind blew from the east, I would still hear distant singing. The simple, childlike melody of Frère Jacques would drift through the darkness, a reminder that some injustices demand their own form of reckoning.